So I don't know how many of you know about the Trout Lake field station for UW-Madison, but it is a year-round field station operated by the Center for Limnology at UW-Madison, and it's located in the Northern Highland Lake District in northern Wisconsin. The station provides access to a wide variety of aquatic ecosystems and their surrounding landscapes. There are more than 2,500 lakes within 50 kilometers of that station. So a lot of places for them to be able to study freshwater lakes. Susan Knight, our speaker today, is working with Dr. John Havel from Missouri State University on a research project involving aquatic invasive species, something many of us are worried about. They are trying to determine the effectiveness of the milfoil weevil on controlling Eurasian water milfoil in a field experiment. She also conducts other aquatic plant identification workshops, participates in the review and implementation of aquatic plant management and science projects with the DNR, and participates in outreach activities, one of which is speaking to you today. I give to you Dr. Susan Knight.
Okay, no problem. Well, this is going to be a trial that I have to stay put, so I'll give it a try. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here. It's just a wonderful opportunity to talk to groups. I recently read the biography of Albert Einstein, and one of his more famous quotations, I'm sure you've heard it before, is that he said of himself, "I'm not particularly talented." That's doubtful, but anyway, that's what he said. I'm not particularly talented. I am just passionately curious. And I think that's a very good statement of what you all are like, that you are still, you're attending these classes in order to keep learning. It's certainly what I think is part of my life, that I'm just passionately curious. And that's why I'm interested in science and why I work at a field station where we can do science all day, every day. It's just a fabulous place to work. So, as Vicki said, the Trout Lake Station is about 75 miles north of here, straight up 51, just half a mile, really, from Highway 51 in Boulder Junction, sort of Arborvita, Boulder Junction area, just and Manitowish Waters up that way. Can I see anybody who's been to Trout Lake or up into that area? Oh, lots of people. Great. Okay. So I don't really need to tell you too much about it. So at any rate, Trout Lake Station is a branch of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We have a facility down on the Madison campus, the Hassler Lab, which in the organization is called the Center for Limnology, and it's kind of an offshoot of zoology from a number of years ago. And there are principally 4 faculty members there and various graduate students and a lot of staff and in the pursuit of limnology, which is the study of inland waters. So I am not advancing. There we go. Oops, I'm going to advance too far. Yes. Okay. I'm back. There we go. Okay, so Trout Lake Station is, today in my talk I'm going to talk about the different kinds of things that we are studying. Why do lakes differ? I'm going to talk a lot about aquatic invasive species because that's a lot of what we talk about or what we study up there. We do quite a bit of investigation on shorelines and what their importance and how people are affecting them and what we can do to preserve them. And we also are involved in quite a bit to do with climate change. Finally, we are very involved in events like this of engaging the public and trying to spread the word about science, especially about limnology. Trout Lake Station has been going since the 1920s. It was founded on Trout Lake by E.A. Burge, and many of you, if you went to UW-Madison, you know about Burge Hall. Burge Hall was named after E.A. Burge. He was a professor of zoology, and when he retired, he started the Trout Lake Station. And we have, I'll show you in a second, some pictures of him. He was pretty elderly when he started Trout Lake Station. It was started on the shores of Trout Lake. And so we continue to do research up there and do training of graduates, undergraduates, and graduate students, and we do a lot of outreach. This is Professor Burge on the left. You can see that he was fairly elderly. This picture was taken in the 30s. And his right-hand man was Chauncey Judet, who did quite a bit of work. And there you can see them out in a boat in Trout Lake in the 1930s. Down in the bottom left, you can see the Trout Lake crew from 1938. Even back then, they had a crew. And one of our 2013 crew that you can see there on the bottom right. We have a number of undergraduates that come up every year, mostly to assist the graduate students with their work, and the graduate students, of course, are working under the professors. This is the Northern Highland Lake District. The county in the middle is, this is Vilas County, Oneida County down here, then Lincoln County down there, and then Marathon County would be just south of there. You can see the star over there depicting this area. So if you want to study lakes, there is really no better place just about in the world to study lakes. Parts of Finland have such a density of lakes. Of course, Minnesota has a good density of lakes as well. And parts of England do too, and parts of Siberia do too. So generally, it's the glaciated parts of northern hemisphere that have glaciers that left behind these beautiful little kettle hole lakes all over the place and are infinitely intriguing for us. We spend quite a bit of effort training undergraduates and graduate students in all manner of things aquatic, from streams to lakes, from algae to fish. One of our biggest concerns is studying individual lakes, and we can look at these different lakes. We've got Firefly over here, Crystal Lake, Fallison Lake, Emerald or Wildwood Lake here. But it's much more interesting to study them in the entire landscape. This is a picture. You can see Trout Lake up here in the upper left. This is Big Muskie Lake, Little John, Aliquash. It's quite a landscape. And I think the landscape from this perspective looks pretty flat, but it's actually not. And it presents an intriguing way to look at lakes. So why neighboring lakes do differ, and why is that? You might think they've got the same origin. They're all left over from the glaciers receding about 10,000 years ago. They have the same geological setting. They're mostly just sitting on piles of sand. Of course, we've got pretty much the same weather and climate in all of these lakes, and the same species pool of fish, algae, zooplankton, whatever. And generally, we have the same access potential by humans. But they are actually very different. Some of them are tiny, and some of them are over 3,000 acres. Trout Lake is one of the biggest in the area, at a little over 3,000 acres. Some of those little lakes have no fish, and some of them have up to 37 species, so it's a huge variety there. The threat of acidification can be very low, whether or not it's well buffered or not. And in some of the lakes, there's really no danger of acidification, something that we studied back in the 80s and 90s tremendously. The color varies tremendously. Some of the lakes are quite blue. Some of them are green, mostly from algae, and some of them are brown, mostly from stained particles, especially our little bog ponds. The water levels can be pretty steady, or they can fluctuate wildly. The water clarity can be very clear, even within those different colors, or it can be kind of turbid. Some lakes get tons of boat use, and some get almost none. Hardly ever visiting. And sometimes the fishing is great, and sometimes you say, well, why bother? You're going to catch a mud minnow at best. So why are these lakes so different? The biggest difference, believe it or not, even though the terrain looks incredibly flat, is that that there is a gradation, that some of the lakes are higher in the landscape and some are lower in the landscape. Some, if you look at a topographic map, you can see right in the center, usually they have the elevation of that particular lake, and it's kind of an average because they do go up and down. And you can see that lakes, some lakes are higher in the landscape and some are lower. So, but the biggest difference is not just that they're higher and lower in the landscape, because the difference is only usually a couple of feet. But the biggest difference, well, one of the things they have in common, of course, is that they all get precipitation, snow and rain throughout the year. But the biggest difference is groundwater. Up in these lakes that are perched up in the top, if you've ever been up to Crystal Lake, a nice campground right near Trout Lake, very extremely clear water. We could just about use it for our distilled water if we ever ran out. Just filter out the bacteria a little bit, and you have pretty much distilled water from Crystal Lake. And it's sitting right up in the landscape, not very high, just a few feet above, but it has very little groundwater coming in. And lakes further downstream and in a little bit different place in the landscape have a lot more groundwater coming in. And then you've got lakes like Trout Lake that not only have groundwater coming in, but they also have streams coming in. And that makes all the difference in the world in what kind of a lake you have. So lakes high in the landscape, lakes such as Crystal, tend to be small. They're usually vulnerable to acidification. They don't have much chemical power to resist acidification. They don't have much buffering capacity. They don't usually have many algae, so they're usually quite clear. The water level can fluctuate wildly, as it did, I'll show you in another couple slides, back in the 2000s. They usually have pretty low diversity, not a lot of zooplankton species, not a lot of fish, not a lot of algae, not a lot of plants, just kind of puttering along at low diversity. And generally don't have a lot of boater use because they're small and because they don't usually have very many fish. Lakes low in the landscape, kind of like Trout Lake, which is a beautifully clear lake, but it still, nonetheless, is much more nutrient-rich than Crystal Lake, which is about a half a mile away. Generally not vulnerable to acidification. They usually have lots of algae. The water level tends to be steady. They've got a high diversity of fish and all sorts of organisms. They tend to be larger, and they tend to have a lot of boats. So that right there kind of divides lakes into two different groups. And of course it is a continuum, and you've got lakes, all kinds of lakes in the middle. Here's a response to drought. We study at Trout Lake, we have one of our big projects is called long-term ecological research. And we are one of many sites around the country that study some part of our landscape intensively. And in our site, of course, it's lakes. We study 7 lakes intensively. The 7 lakes include Trout Lake and Crystal Lake that I just mentioned, Sparkling, Big Muskie, and Aliquosh. So those are our 5 bigger lakes, and then 2 small bog ponds that are kind of similar to each other, but one is a lot deeper than the other. Trout Lake is the only one that has streams coming in. The others are all seepage lakes, meaning that they only get water, or their water comes from either precipitation or from groundwater. Trout Lake has precipitation, groundwater, and streams. And you can see from this graph that we have along the bottom, we have year. So this is from 1980 to 2015. And we have the water level, how much it's going up from some sort of arbitrary starting point. Back in from about 2000 to 2010 or 12, you folks probably remember that it was very dry, it was very sunny. We ended up with a lot of evaporation and not a lot of rain. That means that water levels generally will go down. And indeed, that is what happened in Crystal Lake, Sparkling Lake, and Big Muskie, 3 of those lakes that I just talked about that we have coming in our study area. Trout Lake, with all of the streams coming in, the water level did go down some, but it's much steadier. So that's a big factor on why you're going to see a big difference between the lakes. Another thing that we study quite a bit is how are invasive species changing our lakes. So first of all, one of the big things we have up north and throughout Wisconsin, of course, throughout North America, is Eurasian water milfoil. That's kind of creating havoc, not maybe as bad as people think. I was part of the crew that we kind of rue the day that we were saying things like, oh, getting Eurasian water milfoil is like getting cancer or something. I mean, it was just, we way overblew it. It's really not. But it is a problem, and people want to try and solve it. Another problem invasive species are rusty crayfish, rainbow smelt, spiny water flea, and zebra mussels. And I'm going to talk about a few of these. First of all, the rusty crayfish. This is, we do have native crayfish up here, and generally they're smaller than the rusty crayfish. The rusty crayfish are native to North America, but more down in the Ohio River Valley. And were brought up almost certainly in bait buckets and released because people thought they were great bait fish. And almost always, when you do something like that, there are unintended consequences. So what happens is rusty crayfish tend to, I'm going to show you some pictures in a second, but rusty crayfish are abundant in Trout Lake and they're abundant in Sparkling Lake. And what happens is that the rusty crayfish are basically lawnmowers. They just come along with their little pincers and cut down all the plants. And they do eat them, but they cut down a lot more than they can actually eat. So they bite them with their mouth and with their pincers. And as you can see from this graph, we have year. They came in the early 80s into Trout Lake and up to 2015. And this is the plant biomass in the blue on the left. So the plant biomass was bouncing around. We measure it every year using scuba. And you can see that starting in about early 90s, the numbers just started to go down in the aquatic plants. That was simultaneous with the crayfish. Here are the crayfish numbers on the right here in the red, and the crayfish numbers are just marching up. So as crayfish numbers go up, the plants go down. And it's quite dramatic in Trout Lake. It just looks like a big bowl of sand. There are very few places where there's much of any vegetation left anymore at all. This is kind of an example of what you would see if you had crayfish on the right here, and if you don't have crayfish. It's pretty amazing. So here's a whole lot of crayfish. One of our questions was, can we eliminate them? We did not try to do this in Trout Lake. Trout Lake is about 3,000 acres. That would have been a little bit too much. But we did try it. Gretchen Hansen, who was one of our graduate students back in the 90s, took this project on in Sparkling Lake, which is just right across Highway 51 from Trout Lake. And a trapping day would be how many days they put out a trap and how many traps and then how many years. So you multiply all that together and you get over 75,000 trapping days, and they collected almost 100,000 crayfish. So what happened was that the crayfish numbers, here are the numbers of crayfish per trap, and they bounce around a lot. But then here is where they started trying to remove them. And they were dramatically successful. And so what they did was, early on, they figured out exactly where most of the crayfish were, and they collected the traps every other day and disposed of the crayfish, and they had a tremendous effect. So pre-removal, this is kind of what it looks like, and then post-removal, this is what Sparkling Lake looks like now. Not only do you get plants back, but perhaps more importantly for a lot of people, the bluegill and pumpkin seed, all those fish that really rely on plants really came back as well. So we've continued to keep the crayfish numbers down. It's not just, we're not trapping anymore, but we do monitor it. But what happened was we got the crayfish numbers down low enough that the fish now can pick off, especially the little crayfish, and keep those numbers down. So once we got kind of on top of it, at least for the time being, that lake is hardly crayfish free, but it is, has a lot more plants, has a lot more bluegills, a lot more panfish, and was a pretty interesting experiment. One of the other things that happened simultaneously was that the water levels dropped in Sparkling, and it removed a lot of habitat that crayfish like. Crayfish really like this cobbly ground, bottom sediment, and it was exposed because the water level dropped so much. And so they lost a lot of their habitat. So that kind of helped us out in our removing of the crayfish because they didn't have the habitat that they prefer. So these experiments are never done in a vacuum. They're always complicated. We didn't do it in another lake in the same time, so it's not a controlled experiment, but it's the kind of work that we have to do under the constraints we have to deal with. Another invasive species is rainbow smelt, also brought in as a bait fish. And a lot of people think rainbow smelt are fantastic food for walleye. And indeed they are. They're great food for adult walleye. But they compete with perch directly, and so pretty much eliminate perch, which are also good food for walleye, and they eat walleye eggs. And so you can have a terrific trophy walleye fishery if you've got smelt in your lake, but eventually you're not going to have any walleye reproduction. So rainbow smelt are a tremendous problem in a number of lakes. They're not in Trout Lake, but they are in Sparkling Lake that had the rusty crayfish problem, and they're in Crystal Lake. And up in our neck of the woods, they're also in Fence Lake and a couple of other lakes. So actually, let me go back for just a second. So just like we saw the plants drop off with the rusty crayfish, as we have yellow perch bouncing along, and when the rainbow smelt come in, the perch just go down to zero and the smelt just take off. Now we did a really fabulous experiment trying to get rid of the smelt. Now smelt really, like whitefish and trout, like cold water. And in Crystal Lake is deep enough that it has good cold water down deep. And that's where the smelt like to hang out. So what we thought was, how about if many of you know that lakes are warm on the surface and cold down below in the summertime. They stratify, they form layers. And so that nice warm layer is not where the smelt like to hang out. They like to hang out in the cold waters in the middle of the summer. So we thought, what if we could mix the entire lake so that the entire lake was warm and too warm for the smelt? And they had done lab studies that indicated that smelt could not survive temperatures up around 23, 24 degrees, which is what the surface waters of our lakes usually are. That's centigrade. And so we had great, we had great confidence that all we had to do was spin this lake and mix it. Lakes naturally mix in the spring and in the fall, but what we were going to do was mix it in the middle of the summer. So take all that cold water, bring it up, and let the sun warm it up, and then mix it so that the entire lake was the same temperature, the same warm temperature, top to bottom. And believe it or not, we did it. I shouldn't say we. I had nothing to do with it. But this is the apparatus we used. Did anybody by any chance ever get up to Crystal Lake while this was going on? Oh, a number of you. Great. Okay. So this was in Crystal Lake, which is a pretty small, very round lake with a simple basin. And we had these things. You can see that this contraption here is quite small relative to the lake. I'm going to leave it to your imagination to how big the lake is. But we had these things in the lake that were kind of like, imagine a trampoline, and about the size of a trampoline. And what happened was that they had a big air bladder in them, and the air bladder, the thing, imagine it down at the bottom, this trampoline-like thing, rubbery sort of round trampoline-like thing, down at the bottom of the lake with a big air bladder. We would pump air into the air bladder, and that, of course, would make this trampoline rise. And then the air would vent out the top, and it would go, psh, and then the whole thing would fall back down to the lake bottom. And then it would fill with air again and rise up, and then psh, and then go back down again. And this went on constantly, all the time. We had 6 of these things going up and down. And son of a gun, if it didn't mix that lake, even as small as it is in terms of area, it mixed the entire lake so that the entire lake was all the same temperature. So what happened to the smelt? Well, will the smelt die? Well, most of them did. Unfortunately, most is not good enough. Smelt are incredibly prolific. We think we got rid of about 90%. And let me tell you, there was a seagull fiesta out there. The smelt were dying and flopping around on the surface, and the seagulls were just going nuts. In fact, our workers had a very hard time collecting any of the fish because the seagulls were so efficient. But we, in studies since, we do think we got rid of about 90%. But the smelt are naturally very boom-bust sort of species, and we don't really feel very confident that we were especially as successful. So good luck on the crayfish, not such good luck on the smelt, although we learned a ton about mixing lakes and what happens when the lake temperature goes way up.
How did they get in that lake since that isn't really a fishing lake? I mean, it's a small lake.
It's not really a fishing lake, but it does have some fish, and definitely people do fish there. And it used to have or has a few walleye in it, so people, especially they're camping, let's just go fishing. So at any rate, the smelt were undoubtedly put in by somebody on purpose. But there's no streams or anything like that. As Vicki told you, I've been involved in a study on Eurasian water milfoil. So one of the other invasive species we're working on is Eurasian water milfoil, which is a plant which tends to, the problem with Eurasian water milfoil is that it grows aggressively, crowds out other plants, grows up to the surface and then tops out so that it interferes with basically human recreation. It interferes with swimming and fishing and boating, and because it's sitting there kind of topped out at the bottom, it also tends to overrun the native plants. So there have been studies done with a milfoil weevil. It's this adorable little critter here that has this long proboscis. It is natural here in Wisconsin. It normally eats northern water milfoil, which is a native plant here. And it will eat and loves to eat Eurasian water milfoil. In fact, it does better on Eurasian water milfoil than its natural host. But it's just not very abundant, and it doesn't have a very high fecundity. It does not reproduce very fast. So there was a company that started raising these weevils, and you would actually buy the weevils from this company, and then you could put them out on your lake and let the weevils chow down, and they would overwinter and then move back out onto the lake in the next springtime, chow down all summer, move to the shore, come back out, and that was the idea. So people wanted to use DNR grant monies in order to buy weevils, in order to try to control Eurasian water milfoil with weevils rather than chemicals, which is all you can understand. A lot of people don't want to put chemicals on their lake. So, but the DNR charged me and my colleague John Havel with testing whether or not this was really effective. There was a lot of anecdotal evidence, and actually a great deal of lab work as well, especially done by folks over in Minnesota, showing that they could be very effective, but it hadn't been done in an experimental setting. So we set out to do that. As I said, the milfoil weevil is native to Wisconsin, so we weren't introducing anything exotic. It prefers Eurasian water milfoil, but the weevil itself is not very abundant. So we did an experiment in 4 lakes, and we added weevils to 2 beds of Eurasian water milfoil and left 2 alone. So it was a controlled experiment. Unfortunately, the weevils were not very effective. We already have a lot of weevils in our lakes, and so the numbers of weevils we were adding was actually not all that substantial compared to what was already out there. You would really have to add a huge number of weevils, and that is really a problem. We also discovered that the weevils are quite rare in lakes that have been treated by chemicals. So in lakes with Eurasian water milfoil that have been treated mostly with 2,4-D, those lakes generally have pretty low weevil concentrations, weevil numbers. The lakes that have only northern water milfoil, they do have weevils, but they do not have that many weevils either. The lakes that have the most weevils are the lakes with Eurasian water milfoil that have not been treated with chemicals. So perhaps there's a lesson there. How are people changing lakes? People have can really have a dramatic effect on lakes. Certainly when we, pre-settlement times, there weren't little cabins all over the lakes, and wood would fall into the lakes, plants would grow, fish would grow and die, and things were pretty much left to their own devices. Since certainly the 40s, 50s, 60s, we've had a lot more cabin development on lakes. Then you get into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and now you're looking at little McMansions all over the North Woods. And so we have had a tremendous, tremendous effect on a lot of our lakes. And so one of the things that we've been studying is the effect of wood and climate change on our lakes. I'm going to, go back just for a second. Okay, so I'm going to lecture you now. This is the bad boy of the North Woods, okay? This is a beautiful home that people will love to come by and look at all those windows. Aren't those people enjoying a beautiful view out their window? But what you might not realize or appreciate is that they have mowed their lawn all the way down to the shore. They have put some riprap, some rock here on the shore. There is no natural vegetation. My guess is they're probably using fertilizer. I don't know. I mean, we supposedly don't have phosphorus in our fertilizers anymore. Who knows? But at any rate, probably fertilizing their lawn. It's got a straight shot right into the lake, which is going to make the lake higher in phosphorus than it should naturally be. When you don't have a natural buffer along the shore, the water will, or rainwater, whatever, will run off, and it isn't slowed down, and it will either make it more turbid out here just from runoff, and also you'll end up with more nutrients because they're not stopped on the shoreline. Also, right here on the shoreline, you're not going to have all the critters that you normally would have along a shoreline. Songbirds, frogs, all those kinds of insects. My guess is, I can't see, my guess is that there are no plants down there. They're probably hauled them all out. So this is not good for the lake environment. It is only good for those people looking out the window. So, end of my lecture. Okay. This is what a natural, whoopsie, I'm going to go forward. This is what a natural lake looks like underwater with lots of wood. If you have lots of wood, you almost always have lots of fish. If anybody's been snorkeling, scuba diving in your lake, or even fishing, you don't go, my guess is you would not go fishing in front of this house. You would know, well, there's not going to be any fish there. But if you see a big downed tree or something with a few branches sticking out, likely you would say, wow, primo fishing right there, at least for panfish. Okay. So what have we done about studying this? We've done quite a bit of studies looking at the amount of wood and how the fish fare. So here we have residential development, number of buildings per kilometer. So if over here there are very few buildings along your shore, out here lots of buildings along your shore. And up here is the number of logs, the woody habitat, the number of logs and sticks that you see. And there is a huge difference. Residential development has caused a loss of woody habitat in shallow waters of lakes. So this is the kind of thing you see. You see all of this armoring of cement and just grass right down to the shore. Probably no plants in here, no wood, and this is not good for our lake situation. We did a tremendous experiment up on Little Rock Lake, up in north, right across the highway from Trout Lake. And this is Little Rock Lake. It was also the scene of an acidification project a number of years ago, but it was repurposed for a woody habitat project. And there is a curtain right here in this lake, so that this lake is separated from this basin, North Basin, South Basin. And the little green dots are where they found wood, logs of one sort or another, and they measured them all. And then they basically hired the football team, and they pulled all the logs out of the lake, only on this side. This side had just as many logs, or almost as many. You see, this had 344, this had 475 logs per kilometer. These are not pictured here. They didn't map them, but they still numbered them, or they had a count of them. So this is what the log population looked like to start with, and then this is what it looked like after. So they really pulled out a lot of the wood out of Little Rock Lake. And these guys did all the work using come-alongs and their backs, and ended up a lot stronger. So what happened? Well, the first thing is the perch disappeared, absolutely gone. Where did they go? Into the tummies of the bass. So the bass had a field day for a couple of weeks, kind of like those seagulls eating the perch, or eating the smelt over on Crystal. So the perch disappeared, and the bass went nuts for a couple of weeks. But then what did the bass do? The bass suddenly didn't have, and why did the perch disappear? Because they had no place to hide. Because the wood was extremely important for the perch as a hiding place and for where the bass would look for their food. The bass started, the wood was pulled up on shore, but not all that far up on shore, and so it made some terrific terrestrial habitat for mice and snakes and frogs and things like that. And that's what the bass started eating. We would find, they joked that they found a squirrel inside of a bass. I don't really think that was true. But they were definitely capturing things that you think of as more terrestrial. So anyway, there was it was fairly conclusive that the wood is extremely important for the fish. By the way, they did the corollary experiment. They added wood to a lake that naturally didn't have much for whatever reason, just a little ways away, Camp Lake. And they use, in the winter, we took wood treetops from a logging operation using cement blocks, anchored them to the bottom of this lake, and when it melted, of course, the logs fell into the water, into the shallow water. And they had tremendous recruitment of fish, mostly bass, over in that lake. So the reciprocal experiment kind of proved the point. Wood is very effective for increasing the size of a fish. You've got largemouth bass here. This is their age. If you want your fish to get big, if you have wood, they will reach that size early, after about 5 years. If you don't have much wood, it's going to take a whole lot longer. So fish simply do better in woody habitats. Low water also has an effect on wood in lakes. It's not just people hauling the wood out. It's also when the water levels drop, it's as if you hauled all the wood out. So this is what a couple of our lakes up north look like. I think at least one of these is Little Rock, and I think one of these is Fallison. But you can see all the wood just stranded on shore as the water level dropped. The water levels are up substantially now. One other project we have, which isn't really related to invasive species or to lake levels, is a new experiment that is kind of interesting. A lot of you may be involved in citizen lake monitoring. Does anybody involved in that, where you sample your own lake? Oh, lots of you, okay. So as you probably know, most lakes are sampled smack dab in the middle to see what's there. And to see how deep it is, well, of course, you probably already know that, but to see how clear the water is and things like that. These fellows with this project are starting to sample the lakes across the entire surface, and they can measure a number of variables at once. They have a machine that will sip the lake water. It processes it through some equipment that they've got in these coolers, and then they get a spatial description of the lake. In this particular case, they're looking at oxygen and how in some parts of the lake, oxygen levels are much higher, almost certainly because of increased productivity from algae in some parts of the lake relative to others. So that's a new project, and it's going to be fun to see what they do. They've actually taken this equipment down the Mississippi to look at oxygen levels and nutrients and things like that. So it'll be very interesting to go the entire course of the Mississippi and see what's happening. All right, I want to finish out with some climate change talks. Temperature is probably the key subject of what's important in lakes. Temperature controls how much oxygen can be dissolved in the lake. The colder the water, the more oxygen is involved. Fish growth and survival has a lot to do with temperature. How much, these are little zooplankton. They do reproduce usually faster when the temperatures are up. Algae reproduce faster when the temperatures are up. And nutrients sometimes cycle faster, or usually faster, when temperatures are up. So if our climate is changing, things are going to change in our lakes tremendously. That was driven home, a recent paper just in December this past month. A number of authors have looked at data all across the world, over 200 lakes, and have found that the lake temperatures around the world are warming up much faster than the air temperature and than the oceans are. So, and the lakes that are warming up the fastest are lakes that are northern and deep. Lakes like Lake Superior, Lake Baikal in Russia. Superior has temperature has risen about 2 degrees per decade, they recommend, or they estimate, since about 1980. So the temperature is really going up, and you can see from here that this is how much the temperature is going up. The more red, the more the lakes' temperatures are going up. A few lakes are in the blue, are actually cooling off, but not too many of them. So that's a matter of concern. I'll just finish out with one last climate change, not to do with lakes, but other research going on at Trout Lake is how tree seedlings are being affected by climate change. It turns out that trees really need a deep snowpack in order to survive the winter. And with decreasing snow depths or snow not lasting as long, the seedlings are not as likely to do as well, and they're more subject to pathogens. And so we may see changes in reproduction of our trees. Now I'm just going to finish off with some other outreach projects that we do. We are involved in a number of art and science projects, and also on a Science on Tap. I'm going to tell a little bit about those. The first one is we have an artist in residence every year at Trout Lake, and we invite them up to spend a week or two engaging with our scientists and doing whatever kind of art they like to do. We've had a couple of other larger events with art that have resulted in tremendous amounts of great artwork that has traveled the country. The last thing I want to talk about is another outreach event that I'm involved in. It's called Science on Tap Minocqua. It's held in Minocqua at the Minocqua Brewing Company. Maybe some of you have been up there. It's a great restaurant and a great venue. And we invite speakers in, some from the DNR, a lot from the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. And we have found that we get a terrific crowd coming out. They drink beer, the speaker's drinking beer, and it's not a lecture. They give about 20 minutes or 15 minutes of introduction, and then it's really just question and answer. And so it's very engaging. People are loosened up, and it's a terrific, fun time. We just had it last night, and our topic was citizen science and how citizens around the world, certainly around Wisconsin, are helping out the regular professional scientists with collecting data. So, just as a recap, let me remind you that I talked about that neighboring lakes can differ remarkably, but fairly predictably. Water level fluctuations can affect lake ecology. Invasive species are a tremendous concern on our lakes. Woody habitat is extremely important. Leave those trees alone. And climate change is changing our lakes, and we will see more in the future. And finally, art and beer are good outreach catalysts. Thank you very much.
Although she was born in Massachusetts, I think she understands the Wisconsin culture. Thank you, Susan, so very much. And now we've got time for some questions. And I'll go around here with the microphone and go over here to you first, Dick.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but
you are anyway.
given some of the recent budget actions in Madison by some of our knowledgeable legislators, there's been an impact on the DNR, particularly on the scientific end of it. And how has this impacted, or what do you anticipate how this might impact what you are doing and others are doing in this arena?
Yeah, for sure there have been some major cuts. The DNR has taken the major hit, for sure. At our institute, our institution, most of our money comes from the National Science Foundation, and we, at least at this point, have not been hit as hard. So our faculty are tremendously successful at getting grants, and so we are insulated. But for example, the woman that did all that work on the crayfish, who trapped all those crayfish, she was with Science Services, and she is now on her way to Minnesota. So I work personally with the science services folks in Madison, and that little colony of aquatic scientists has largely been disbanded, and it's very sad.
You mentioned the rainbow smelt in Fence Lake,
Yes.
and I thought that they tried planting brown trout to eat the smelt there, and I wondered how that worked, or do you know anything about other alternatives to the plan in Crystal?
I have only just heard about that. I think you know more than I do, so I'm sorry. It does seem like a great idea if you could get another fish. I think another fish person in here would tell me, yes, brown trout are exotic to Wisconsin? Yes? No? I'm not sure. So you always want to be careful with that kind of thing, but I'm afraid I don't know the story on Fence Lake.
If a lake has been treated for the Eurasian milfoil, how long do those chemicals remain?
The chemicals usually that are used for Eurasian water milfoil, it's usually 2,4-D. On many of our lakes, when the chemical is put in, citizens usually will go out and monitor, will take water samples, and so they will assess how fast it is degrading. What we have found in experiments is that it varies quite tremendously. Sometimes it's gone within 24 hours, and in some lakes it takes 2 months to disappear. It seems to be whether or not there is a good microbial community. The chemical is broken down by bacteria. And so if you're in a sandy lake, and you would think, well, not very many sandy-bottomed lakes that don't have much of any microbe community would have Eurasian water milfoil. That's actually not true. It's certainly not something you can count on. They did do a very interesting study. This is the DNR Science Services again, on 2 lakes, Sandbar and Tomahawk, not the Tomahawk near us, but up in Bayfield County. And the 2 lakes are just barely connected, and they both had Eurasian water milfoil, and they treated one and not the other, and they used what they thought was the right amount of 2,4-D in the one lake, in Tomahawk Lake, and they ended up still having chemical in the lake 2 months out. And it absolutely decimated the entire plant population. So that was not good. So we learned a lot. And then the next, a few years later, they treated Sandbar Lake with a much lower level of chemical, and it had much more the desired effect, affected the Eurasian water milfoil, but not the native plants quite so much. So it's not completely consistent. Some lakes, it disappears very quickly, and in some, it lingers on. But we're learning a lot, and that's mostly due to the Science Services aquatic plant research folks.
If the milfoil was pulled out, would those weevils have a better chance of controlling it then? Hand pulled?
If you hand pull the plants and you're not using chemicals, yes, whatever weevils remain. Now, the weevils are pretty much on the milfoil. So, but there's probably not much point in trying to peel the weevils off of the milfoil you do pull out and put them back on. That would just be too labor intensive. But it is sort of a yin and a yang. I mean, as you pull out the plants, you are pulling out the weevils at the same time.
Could you tell me how long the rusty crayfish experiment went on, and were those crayfish repurposed?
They were repurposed. They were delicious. But the experiment went on about 3 or 4 years.
Are you all concerned about the zoning changes along the lakeshore fronts that are being proposed or have already been enacted as to, shore erosion?
Yes, some of the changes that have been proposed for the shorelines are extremely disconcerting. We, as maybe many of you here believe, that the counties are probably better off being in charge of how the shorelines are regulated. The counties, Vilas and Oneida County, have stricter laws about what you can do on your shoreline, and this will relax those laws so that you can have more houses per shoreline. And that, given that almost always the more buildings you have, the less wood you have, the less plants you have, et cetera, will almost for sure impact our lakes. So yes, I am sorry to see these new regulations in place. And they are being debated, I think, yesterday and today.
Our lake is in northern Vilas County. We're worried about the milfoil. We are voluntarily monitoring our boat landings. We have no authority. Is this likely to be effective or not?
You have no authority to call somebody if you see somebody going in with a plant on your
We ask them to remove it, and that's
Yes.
all we can do.
Right. But you can call the warden, and the wardens are certainly able to respond legally. So I know that often the best thing to do is to take a photo. For example, well, we had an actual, they call them a water guard. It's sort of, it's not exactly a warden, but sort of a step down. And the water guard found someone going into Aliquosh Lake, which doesn't have any people on it and doesn't have any kind of monitoring. And someone was bringing in a boat loaded with Eurasian water milfoil and zebra mussels. So, yeah, and so luckily he was there, and he, ticketed the guy. So it is legal, it is against the law to not only launch a boat with plants on it, it's illegal now to have a boat, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. It's illegal to transport plants going down the highway. So you can call things in, and whether or not something's going to happen is, I can't say for sure, but there are legal ramifications for carrying weeds on your vehicle or your trailer or your boat.
I was wondering about pollution from boats and things that, how bad is that on the lakes for fish?
It's how bad is pollution, mostly coming from motors, things like that. Well, I don't really know, but I do know that the four-stroke engines, those great big ones, I think Honda came out with them originally, and a lot of the manufacturing companies have them now, are more efficient, and I think they have let less gas in. I really don't know, but I think that that's the case, that the motors are getting better. So it's a good thing to keep in mind.
Who's doing the study up there on the 5 lakes like Escanaba that you have to tell them how much
That
fish
is
and what you're
that is a DNR project. The project she's talking about is that there's a 5-lake research area not far from Trout, including Escanaba, Pallet, Nebish, Mystery, and Spruce Lakes. And those last 2 are quite small, but the other 3 are big fishing lakes. And if you want to fish there, it's perfectly fine, but they ask that you come back and tell them all your particulars, how long you fished, what you fished for, and if you caught anything, they take a scale and take some measurements on it. And that is the DNR Science Services Fish Division.
I think we've asked all the questions. Oh. No, okay. Well, let's give a round of, no, we've got a few more. And we have, okay.
I just wondered if there were other lake organizations that you work with. Isn't Clam Lake the UW-Stevens Point area? I'm not quite sure.
Clam Lake, I don't know who works up on Clam Lake. Do you know?
I think that's River Falls.
Oh, River Falls, okay. So no, I don't, but we do work very closely with UW-Madison has another field station, Kemp Natural Resources Station, which is part of a different college. We're in Letters and Science, and they're Ag and Life Sciences. No, we're Letters and Science, sorry, and they are Ag and Life Sciences. And they don't do as much lake work, but they are right on Lake Tomahawk and have a spectacular facility. It's beautiful if you ever get a chance to go there.
I've taken some of you on a field trip up to the Kemp Field Station, and they're doing a lot. And we had a speaker here several years ago talking about the wood production that they're working on, some of the research on that, trying to speed up growing trees for biomass as one of their projects at Kemp.
Yeah.
Susan, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you very much for having me.